So let me ask you all something. Have any of you ever actually watched a fish breathe? Not just a glance, but actually watched it. Because if you sit there for more than 10 seconds, you'll start to notice that their mouth is just constantly opening and closing. And if you're anything like me, you eventually think, what is it doing? Is it eating something? Is it thirsty? Or does it just not know how to close its mouth? But then it hits you. That's how it's breathing. But that just raises more questions than answers, because if me or you tried to breathe by opening our mouths underwater, well, we wouldn't be breathing, would we? We'd be drowning. So what does a fish know that we don't? Well, to answer that question, we first have to understand the problem that fish are trying to solve. See, we humans have it easy because the air around us is about 21% oxygen. Our atmosphere is basically a giant oxygen buffet. Water, on the other hand, is stingy because depending on the temperature and how salty it is, water holds somewhere between 4 and 8 parts per million of oxygen. That's roughly 30 times less oxygen than air. So fish are trying to get a vital gas from an environment that barely has any of it. That's why their gills aren't just simple flaps. They're some of the most efficient gas exchange systems in the entire animal kingdom. So how do they actually work? Well, it's quite simple, really. If you look at a fish, the hard plate on the side of its head is called the operculum. Underneath that are the gills themselves, rows of feathery structures that are usually red or pink because they're packed with blood. Now, the gills themselves are made up of rows of filaments, and each filament is covered in even smaller structures called lamellae, and this is where the actual gas exchange happens. And just to add something really cool, the lamellae are incredibly thin, sometimes just a couple of cells thick, so the blood inside them is almost in direct contact with the water itself. Now, a fish breathes by taking water in through its mouth, and then it forces that water over the gills and out through the operculum. The blood flowing through the gills grabs the oxygen from the water and carries it into the fish's body. Simple, right? But the trick is that the blood flows in the opposite direction of the water. This is what you would call counter-current exchange. The water flows one way over the gills, and the blood flows the other way inside them. But why does that matter? Why on earth am I telling you this? Well, I'm telling you because it's important to understand how gills actually work. See, with this opposite flow of direction between blood and water, it keeps a concentration gradient going the entire length of the gill. The blood that has already picked up some oxygen meets water that's still fresh and oxygen-rich, and the blood that hasn't gotten any oxygen yet meets water that's already had some oxygen removed. This way, oxygen keeps moving from water into blood along the whole surface of the gill. And through this process, the fish ends up extracting about 80 to 90% of the oxygen available in the water. To give you some perspective, we inhale air that's 21% oxygen, and our lungs only extract about 25% of what we inhale. So that means a fish is way more efficient at pulling oxygen from its environment than we are. And it has to be because the environment they live in barely has any to begin with. Also, the total surface area of a fish's gills is often larger than the rest of the fish's body, because that's how much space they need to pull enough oxygen out of their stingy environment. Now, fish have two different strategies for getting water over those gills. The ones you see constantly swimming with their mouths open are using something called ram ventilation, meaning they just swim forward and water flows in. The downside is they have to keep moving. This is why sharks like great whites will suffocate if they stop. Other fish use buccal pumping. Buccal means cheek, if you're wondering. Fish like goldfish, groupers, and most other bony fish use muscles in their cheeks and throat to actively pull water in and push it over their gills. And with this method, they don't have to swim to breathe. They can sit perfectly still. If you've ever watched a goldfish in a tank, you'll see that its mouth is constantly opening and closing. That's buccal pumping, and it's a little more work than ram ventilation in terms of muscle effort, but it means they can stay in one spot and hide from predators or just chill if they want to. So that's really the basic system of how fish breathe: mouth, gills, counter-current flow, and either ram or buccal pumping. But if you think every fish follows that formula, you're missing out on some of the weirdest animals on the planet. Take the mud skipper, for example. These fish live in mudflats in the tropics, and they spend a lot of time out of the water. So how do they breathe? They have gills, but gills dry out in air, so they hold a bubble of water in their gill chambers to keep them wet. They also breathe through their skin and the lining of their mouth, both of which are packed with blood vessels and can absorb oxygen from the air as long as they stay moist. Then there are lungfish, which have both gills and a lung. They live in rivers and swamps that dry up seasonally, and when the water disappears, they burrow into the mud, secrete a mucus cocoon that hardens around them, and breathe air using their lung until the rains return. And a really cool thing about lungfish is that they're actually more closely related to us than they are to most other fish, because the evolutionary lineage that produced lungfish eventually produced tetrapods, which are four-legged land animals. This group includes all amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, including humans. So in a sense, our lungs are a refined version of what a lungfish has. Now another group is the labyrinth fish, like bettas. These fish live in oxygen-poor waters like rice paddies and stagnant swamps, so they evolved to have a labyrinth organ, which is a maze-like structure in their head that lets them gulp air from the surface and absorb oxygen directly. They still have gills, but the labyrinth organ does most of the work. That's why bettas constantly swim to the top. They're taking a breath just like we would. And then there are fish that use cutaneous respiration, aka skin breathing. The types of fish that use this method are eels, many catfish species, and loaches. Now these fish often have highly vascularized skin that can absorb oxygen directly from the water. So when someone asks, how do fish breathe underwater, the real answer is that it depends on the fish. Gills are the common thread, but fish have tacked on lungs, labyrinth organs, skin breathing, mucus cocoons, and specialized cheek pumps. They found so many ways to solve the same problem that it's almost hard to keep track. But there's another layer to this story, and it's not a happy one. Remember how water holds between 4 and 8 parts per million of oxygen? That number is sensitive to temperature. Cold water holds more oxygen. Warm water holds less. And with the planet warming, oceans are absorbing a huge amount of that heat. We're now seeing large areas of the ocean called dead zones or hypoxic zones where oxygen levels have fallen so low that fish can't survive, so they either have to flee or suffocate, which hurts the ecosystems of the oceans and the overall health of the planet. And to be fair, some of these zones do happen naturally, but have expanded dramatically because of climate change. And on top of that, agricultural runoff makes the problem worse because fertilizers from farms wash into rivers and eventually the ocean, which causes massive algae blooms. And algae blooms aren't necessarily the problem because they provide food for a whole host of sea creatures. The problem arises when the algae dies, because when that happens, bacteria consume them. And not only do the bacteria consume them, those bacteria also consume huge amounts of oxygen. This results in a dead zone that can stretch for thousands of square miles. The Gulf of Mexico gets one every summer that's often larger than the state of Connecticut. But anyway, that's all there is to say, I guess, so thanks for watching.